Welcome back to Palestine Bookshelf. I'm Stephen Heiner, and today we're going to be discussing the Hasbara Handbook, Promoting Israel on Campus. This was put together by the World Union of Jewish Students. I have a template for this review. If you watched my review on the Israel Project's Global Language Dictionary from 2009, you will remember I told you that I was too irritated to write up an outline, a script for what I would normally do in these videos. And big surprise, the same thing happened here. I'm too irritated to write a script up for this. This information is a little more dated. This is from 2002. So they're reflecting on the Second Intifada being quite new in their memory. And so some of these responses are dated that way. But all Hasbara is Hasbara. It's always the same lying nonsense. So I'm going to go through it again. And as before, I'm going to try to watch my tone, that I don't get too angry, too agitated, and simply try to work through the lies with you so you understand what's going on. There'll be a link in the description to get a copy of this so you can follow along if you can manage to read through all of it yourself without getting too upset. Jewish students are standing at the forefront of the attacks and accusations against Israel and need to make a difference, to fight back. It is really up to us to take the leading role and to explain to those who are critical but open-minded, to those who are liberal and honest, and to those who are not going with the flow, what Judaism is, what Zionism is, and what Israel is, and to explain why they are important to Jews the world over. I mean, the idea that going with the flow isn't what they are. Going with the flow is accepting whatever Israel lies about. That's what going with the flow is. It's actually much harder to push against what Israel lies about. We need to explain what it means to be surrounded by more than 15 hostile dictatorships. Stop for a moment. Ask, why are they hostile? Why are they hostile? Some of them more than 5 times your country's size and population. What does that matter? People are friends all over the world with different sized countries. So the size of your country is not significant. When only 2 of these countries have acknowledged your right to live in your own country. So there are several things wrong with that. Why are there only 2 countries? And why is it your own country? If it were your own country, then why would anyone dispute your right? The fact is, your rights are disputed because it's not your own country. So notice, even when they're articulating what they consider their basic starting points are, it's not even true. It's not their own country. Who could reasonably dispute someone's right to live in their own country? The problem is, it's not their own country. That is disputed, and they're unwilling to engage with that being a point of disputation. The first aim of Israel advocacy is to influence public opinion. Public opinion is very important to Israel and Jewish communities around the world. Secondly, Israel benefits from public support economically, in terms of willingness to visit Israel and buy Israeli goods. This is 2002. This is before BDS has really taken off as an idea. So you can see them articulating right away that this would be a problem if BDS were to ever take off. And this is something I've talked about in a different review on my review of The Lobby USA by Al-Jazeera. I'll put a link to that in the description as well as a card. As much as Israel says BDS doesn't mean anything, they're deadly afraid of BDS. That's why they spend so much time, energy, money, and brain power on trying to stop BDS. Thirdly, a pro-Israel public climate can prevent difficulties for Jewish communities around the world. The second aim of Israel advocacy is to influence public leaders, which we've seen plenty of via the Israel Lobby. I'll put a link to Professor Mearsheimer's book as well as a card for that. It's one of the very first reviews I did for this channel. Much of Israel advocacy concerns being reactive and defending Israel against unfair accusations. However, it is important that Israel activists are proactive too. Proactivity means taking the initiative and setting the agenda. It means being on the attack, trying to create positive impressions of Israel. Audiences, thinking this is, again, the IDF mentality, being on the attack is something positive. I can create positive impressions of Israel by being on the attack. Audiences who have a favorable general impression of Israel are likely to respond favorably when specific issues arise. It is a mistake to only try to promote Israel when she is being strongly criticized in the press. The person who sets the agenda will usually win the debate. Reactivity forces Israel activists to be constantly on the defensive, as in, no, Israel is not that bad. It is much easier to get Palestinian activists defending Arafat against charges of being a corrupt terrorist than it is to explain to disinterested students that Ariel Sharon didn't kill anybody at Sabra and Shatila, which of course he didn't. I put a giant LOL in the margin. These people don't even know that Ariel Sharon is a war criminal and is noted as such by Israeli courts. He was the one who was embarrassed and publicly shamed and forced to be demoted because of what happened in Sabra and Shatila. If you're unfamiliar with that, I'll put a link in the description, as well as a card to Leila Shahid's eyewitness testimonies of what happened at Sabra and Shatila in the days after, to the people that actually happened to them, not someone so ignorant who wrote this, who put, of course he didn't. Sharon was publicly convicted of being responsible for Sabra and Shatila. This is how ignorant they are of their own history. I know that. I'm not a Jew, and I know that. It is much easier to feed students falafel at a party than to explain why Zionism isn't racism to a student who doesn't even know what national self-determination is. Look at, I put LOL again. Everything wrong with that sentence. It is much easier to feed students falafel at a party. What does falafel have to do with Zionism? Falafel is indigenous to the Mediterranean area largely, and to the Levant in particular. What does that have to do with Israel? Is Israel going to claim falafel as Israeli now? Which of course they do. Why Zionism isn't racism? Zionism is definitionally racism. To a student who doesn't know what national self-determination is, if a college student cannot figure out what national self-determination is from the wording itself, that person shouldn't be in college. College students are pretty dumb on many things, but a college student not knowing what national self-determination is, that would be laughable. So everything about this sentence is ignorant. To understand the value of agenda setting, consider the Six-Day War of 1967. When the war was inevitable, Israel decided to seize the initiative through a preemptive strike. This allowed them to control the war from the beginning. I have a number of things on 1967. I will put a link to the playlist, 1967 playlist, in the description. I don't think I can put a card for a playlist up. But there's the USS Liberty. There's the Al-Jazeera documentary on 1967. There's many things that are wrong with this, but this idea of the war was inevitable because Israel made it that way. But Israel is the one who started the 1967 war, and this narrative is outdated. This is still the narrative, I think, from the 60s, where Israel was able to say, well, we were forced to do it, but there's been enough history and enough revelations now that we know that Israel is the one who started the war, and that the other counterparties were just preparing themselves, but they had no plans for an invasion. Ways to promote Israel and be proactive. There are many proactive events and activities you can organize. Demonstrate against Palestinian corruption. I put LOL, as if there's no Israeli corruption to protest against. And what are Israelis doing protesting against Palestinian corruption? That doesn't directly affect the peace process. I've had Palestinians tell me that the PA is corrupt, so that's no great mystery, as if Israeli politicians aren't corrupt, as if American politicians aren't corrupt. That there's not a purity test that has to be passed by Palestinian politicians that other politicians would fail. So why would you be demonstrating against Palestinian corruption as if you care? A Yitzhak Rabin memorial ceremony. My question would be, who killed Yitzhak Rabin? A Jewish terrorist. Why don't we have a ceremony talking about Jewish terrorism, started by Menachem Begin and the Haganah, birthed by Israel? Worldwide terrorism was birthed by Jewish terrorists. Campaign against rogue states developing nuclear weapons. Another LOL. Israel is a rogue state with nuclear weapons. So why do we campaign against Israel? They're not even self-aware as they write their talking points. They don't ever think of self-criticism. They don't ever think of self-reflection. Everyone else is always wrong and we're the victims, when the reality is they're the victimizers. Point scoring is a method of communication that prioritizes making certain points favorable to the speaker and attacking opponents of the speaker by trying to undermine their positions. Point-scoring communication ought to give the appearance of rational debate, whilst avoiding genuine discussion. The aim of the Israeli activist point scorer is to try to make as many comments that are positive about Israel as possible, whilst attacking certain Palestinian positions and attempting to cultivate a dignified appearance. Boy, I mean, this is what they're advertising to the students. Clearly, the adults are not paying attention. I've never seen a Zionist present a dignified appearance. They always look like rabid, slobbering dogs. Point scoring works because most audience members fail to analyze what they hear. Rather, they register only a few key points and form a vague impression of whose argument was stronger. This is usually what happens in U.S. presidential debates. It's a bunch of point scoring. When to point score? Point scoring is the correct method of communication to use when the audience is likely to be only partially engaged. talk radio, student newspapers, large panel discussions, and anything to do with television or the internet should probably be viewed as having partially engaged audiences, and so point scoring is the right way to communicate in these forums. This is 2002. I don't think they envisioned the internet as it exists today, so I think here they're wrong. I think television is right, panel discussions on television is right, but podcast, long-form podcast, this is particularly where you'd want to engage somebody. That didn't exist back in 2002. Point scoring can irritate audiences who are genuinely committed to thinking seriously about their views on a subject. When talking in serious academic circles or talking to friends or answering questions addressed personally by genuinely interested individuals, it is preferable to refrain from point scoring, which can seem shallow, and to instead more fully engage using rational argument. How to score points whilst avoiding debate. Central to point scoring is the ability to disguise point scoring by giving the impression of genuine debate. Audience members can be alienated by undisguised attacks, so all point scoring needs to be disguised. To disguise point scoring, comments need to seem logical, and to follow from what was said before. Use phrases that subtly change the agenda or reframe the debate to do this. Well, that's not really the right question. I don't think we should be focusing on blank. The real point is blank. That's an interesting point, but I don't think we can really begin to address it before we think about blank. You seem to assume blank, an assumption that's impossible to share. Really, we need to consider blank. It's a shame that the Palestinian leadership have led the Palestinian people down a dead end, where conflict and violence leads to tragic situations. Things would have been better if. You could just replace. It's a shame that Israeli leadership have led the Israeli people down a dead end, where conflict and violence leads to tragic situations. Things would have been better if the Israelis had sought peace. I really think that we would all be better served by looking forward instead of back at the things that happened over 50 years ago. The past is important to note, but we have to move on in an attempt for peace. That is why I think we'd be better served. This is a classic. Dismiss the Nakba, dismiss the root causes of the situation, and say, we'll just move past the root causes. So there would be like, a husband and wife in a situation where one of them cheated, and say, well, let's move past the cheating, and it's like, well, if we don't address this, how can we build a future together? We have to address the root causes. So this idea, the things that happened now more, 70 years ago, the things that happened 50 years ago, we have to look forward. That sounds very nice, except we're talking about genocide and the dispossession of land for what is now millions of people. At the time, 750,000, and then another 250,000 in 1967. So 1 million people in that time period. Point supporting Israel. Israel wants peace, and I underline that, but not true. Is willing to make far-reaching concessions to achieve this, not true. Israel is defending itself against terrorists who deliberately kill civilians going about their daily lives. Every Western country, including Israel, needs to defend its own civilians from terrorists. Obviously, that's true. The last sentence. Every Western country, forget about Western, forget about Israel. Every country needs to defend its own civilians from terrorists. The question has to be, why is Israel facing resistance? And remember, they're never going to use the word resistance because resistance is internationally lawful and moral. It's lawful and moral to resist your occupiers. But if you don't use the term resistance, if you instead use the word terrorist every single time, it's very hard for people to quote-unquote support terrorism. So they want to frame it using the word terrorism. They never want to use the word resistance. But I want to remind Israelis, the one or two Israelis who would actually watch this video, Ehud Barak said that if he was born a Palestinian, he would have joined a quote-unquote terrorist organization. What does that tell you? I want you to just reflect on that. What does that mean? It means Barak understood the mentality of the Palestinians, the importance of fighting for your own land. And Barak, being a Jewish terrorist himself, he has a background in this, so he would know. Points pointing out Palestinian feelings. Yasser Arafat and the Palestinian leadership can't be trusted. They have reportedly broken promises and gone against the Oslo Accords. This could be said about Israel. Israel has repeatedly broken promises and gone against the Oslo Accords. They have. They didn't stop the settlements. In fact, they increased the settlements, and they didn't turn over things to the Palestinian Authority that they were supposed to. Arafat agrees to things and then attempts to go back on them. I'm not here to be an apologist for Yasser Arafat. The man was flawed in many ways, but compared to the Israelis, who were never interested in peace, I think Arafat did the best that he could in the circumstances, but he was not what the Palestinians needed, a stronger and better character than Arafat. Yasser Arafat and the Palestinian leadership support terrorists. Again, They're resistance fighters. Ask yourself, root causes, why do these resistance fighters exist? Do they exist for no reason? They just hate Jews. They wake up in the morning and say, I hate Jews. I want to kill Jews. That's just stupid. It's stupid to say that. Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and Hezbollah are terrorist organizations that the Palestinian Authority consistently fails to crack down on. Where did all these things come from? Where did Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and Hezbollah come from? They didn't exist in 1948. They didn't exist in 1967. All three of those organizations come from, if not the first Intifada, by the time of the second. They grew from this. I don't know if I've got room for any more cards, but I'll put links to the books reviews I've done on Hamas and Hezbollah. And the book on Hamas covers a little bit about Islamic Jihad. But the point is, these are outgrowths of the occupation. The reason Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and Hezbollah exist are because of Israel, and Israel is not willing to admit that. Yasser Arafat and the Palestinian Authority are corrupt. Why are they corrupt? Because the Palestinian people are not allowed to move on, have agency, elect other leaders. They've been locked into only having the PA such that when they make another choice, they elect Hamas in Gaza, they're punished for that. So if the Palestinian people aren't allowed to choose against corruption, which is what the 2006 election in Gaza was about, they chose against the corruption of the PA, what is the point of this criticism? If you're criticizing the PA for being corrupt, which it is, what happens when the Palestinian people choose someone else who's not corrupt, or at least has the appearance of potentially not being corrupt, has had a track record with the people of being a charitable organization, and then seeks to be in government, and they get the vote, and you say, no, you can't do that. So you want us to go back to the organization you accuse of being corrupt? What's the point of the accusation? So once again, an accusation that isn't reflective. It doesn't think through. Now, this is 2002, before the 2006 election, so I have to give grace for that, but I'm pointing out that people knew the PA were corrupt, but there weren't other options, really. Palestinian activist. If Israel wants Arafat to stop terror and crack down on militants, why does she make it hard for him to operate by denouncing him, attacking his security services, and forcing the infrastructure of the Palestinian Authority to crumble? Israel activist. It's a real shame that Israel hasn't been able to have a better relationship with Yasser Arafat recently. This sentence avoids debate, turns the attack on Israeli policy towards the Palestinian Authority, and narrows it to focus on Yasser Arafat. So notice that this means that they are conceding all these points. If Israel wants Arafat to stop terror and crack down on militants, why does she make it hard for him to operate by denouncing him, attacking his security services, and forcing the infrastructure of the Palestinian Authority to crumble? All of those accusations are correct, which is why this person is pivoting using the point scoring method that was already articulated. If Arafat's Fatah organization stopped its terror attacks on Israel, then perhaps things would be different. Point 1. Arafat's own organization is terrorist. Remember the reframe. If Arafat's Fatah organization stopped its legitimately moral and legal resistance attacks on Israel, perhaps things would be different. Of course, if Arafat were more trustworthy, things might be better too. Point 2, Arafat is not to be trusted. Why did Israel choose to deal with him then? Is Israel to be trusted? These are counterpoints. At the moment, he is telling the world he's arresting extremists, but the minute after they are arrested, they walk out of prison to attack Israeli civilians with Arafat's blessing. Point 3, Arafat lies to the world. Point 4, Arafat supports terrorists. Again, my question is, why are these people attacking Israeli civilians? Why is there a resistance movement? Go back to root causes, and you have to have an explanation other than saying, we just need to move on from things that happened, in 1948. The ball is in Arafat's court. He can continue to embrace terror, or he can join Israel back at the negotiating table. Point 5, Arafat supports terror. Point 6, Israel wants peace. We have no evidence that Israel wants peace. In fact, all the evidence points to the fact that they want to occupy everything and to genocide out the Palestinians. Genuine debate is fundamentally different to point scoring. In a forum where listeners are mature and interested in the issues, it is appropriate to engage in genuine debate by responding to questions honestly. So, you should be honest in these situations, implying you should be dishonest in other situations. Admitting that things in Israel aren't always perfect. Well, you can admit it here, but don't ever admit it in point scoring. And perhaps even by criticizing certain policies as errant. I put 2 exclamation. How could you dare? That's anti-Semitic. It's anti-Semitic to criticize Israel's government policies. So back in 2002, they even cited that this could even be a response. You couldn't do that now. You couldn't ever suggest that anything is wrong with Israel without being labeled as anti-Semitic. Jewish communities around the world have been surprised by a rise in anti-Semitic incidents since the start of the Second Intifada. Why is that? The extent to which Israel has come under attack since the rise of Palestinian violence in September 2000 has been deeply worrying. Why was there a rise of Palestinian violence in September 2000? How is this connected to Oslo? I'll put a link in the description to a film club I did on an Al-Jazeera documentary about the price of Oslo and why that was a big joke. It is possible to explain some of this interest by considering the importance of Middle East stability to oil prices. Israel's location at a civilizational fault line between Islam and the West, and the importance of Israel to the three great monotheistic religions. Yet a suspicion remains that Israel is still uniquely interesting for reasons that focus on her Jewish character. Unfortunately, many Christians continue to hold to a replacement theology that posits Jews as rejectors of Jesus. They were rejectors of Jesus. Are the Jews going to say that they weren't? And the Jewish role in Israel as illegitimate following their forfeiting of any divine rights to this land. That is correct. They had rights to this land contingent on them following the Messiahs. They rejected the Messiahs, which means they rejected their rights to the land. Myths persist, particularly on the left, about Jewish power and the Jewish role in capitalism, which has been significant but not unique. What myths are there? That there's Jewish control of the media, of Hollywood, of banks? Is this a myth? And these lead to resentment. Apparently, Jewish manifestations of power rankle both anti-Semites on the left and Christian anti-Semites who believe that Jews have rejected their Messiah. Remember, it's anti-Semitic just to notice things. Noticing things is anti-Semitic. Israel is a state with some Jewish character, and Jews around the world have the right to live there. However, not every Israeli is Jewish, not every supporter of Israel is Jewish, and not every Jew supports Israel. Well, that would make those Jews anti-Semitic, right? Conflating the terms Israeli and Jew is often done to express an anti-Semitic position. Wrong. Conflating those two is put forward by the Israel Project and all these other groups, Stand With Us, to insulate Israel from any kind of criticism. As in, the Jews are brutal occupiers. True. We must fight the Jewish oppressors. True. I don't see what's wrong with those statements. For this reason, it is important that Israel activists keep the terms separate and don't forget that many Israelis are not Jewish. It's funny that they're giving this advice even on the other side. I've said before, the parsing of it is really insignificant to me. The idea that if you don't label yourself a Zionist, that you're not a supporter of Zionism. There's plenty of people who are supporting Zionism just by not speaking up against Israel and the way that it conducts itself. That makes them effectively Zionists. So this distinction between Zionism and Judaism, I'm not that interested in it. Consider the difference between describing somebody as a terrorist, freedom fighter, militant, or activist. Words can be applied in clearly biased ways. Consider the differences between reporting firing on the settlement of Hilo, the Jerusalem suburb of Hilo, or on Hilo in the West Bank. More subtle examples might include incursion, invasion, or operation in the West Bank, or assassination, murder, or preventative killing of terrorists. I love it. So if it's preventative killing, it's okay. For example, a headline such as Israel shells Palestinian TV station might lead on to a discussion of the fact that no one was hurt, the reasons Israel took this action, and the problems caused by Palestinian Authority incitement, but the damage to Israel's position is done in the headline because it's silly. Shells Palestinian TV station. This is not how a moral army, how a moral nation conducts itself. You can't win an argument, so you blow up a TV station. It just shows that you can't win the argument. You can't win in among a world of ideas. You can only win by violence. Another example of errant equivalence in action is the extravagant claim that Palestinians are the victims of a so-called Holocaust. Right, we've been watching for 2 years what's been happening, but we're not allowed to use a name which has apparently been trademarked by a specific group of people who are the only group of people who've ever had anything done bad to them. And Norman Finkelstein refers to this as the Holocaust industry. People who play off of this and use it as a brand, claiming to be professional victims for forever. This claim, offensive to Holocaust survivors, tries to gain sympathy for Palestinians by transferring some of an audience's natural sympathy for Holocaust survivors to Palestinians. Attempts are made to draw similarities between two situations when it's quite clear there is no systematic and deliberate plan to kill all Palestinians. I mean, they say this with a straight face. There is a systematic and deliberate plan to kill all Palestinians and ethnically cleanse them. As to whether there was a systematic and deliberate plan to kill all the Jews in Germany, that's questionable. I don't know that that's actually historically provable, but we are able to look historically and prove that there is a systematic and deliberate plan to kill all Palestinians. We don't need verbiage. We can look at actions. Actions speak louder than words. And what have been the Israeli actions in Gaza for the last 18 months? They've spoken very eloquently, and they've woken up a number of people. And the Palestinians have had to pay an unbelievable price to wake up many people in the world who are not awake. And we have to be, in a way, grateful for that, for their sacrifice. They sacrificed so that other people could wake up. Those opposed to Israel use name-calling all the time. Consider the meaning of the word settlement. When applied to Hilo, a suburb of Jerusalem, over the disputed 1967 borders, the word settlement creates the unfortunate impression that Hilo is located in the middle of the West Bank and occupied by religious and political extremists. The image many people have acquired of settlements. Why would they have that idea? I'll put a link in the description to two documentaries that we've covered on the settlements called The Settlers. Both of them have the same name, one from 2016, I think, by Shimon Dotan, and one in 2025 by Louis Theroux. Other examples include referring to the quote-unquote war crimes of Ariel Sharon. I love it. These people think that the war crimes of Ariel Sharon are false accusations. Talking about invasion of the West Bank. It's an invasion. Unless you think you own it, then it would be an invasion. When an army unit enters territory under PA sovereignty in order to find terrorists and so on. If it's under PA sovereignty, then why would you have permission to go there? It's not really under sovereignty if you can just go in whenever you want. It's the fake sovereignty. Israel is a Western democracy in the middle of the Middle East. It is not a Western democracy. It stands for freedom, equal rights for all. This is a joke. Like, I'm going to keep reading this. It is a civilized country whose opera, ballet, and world-class universities ensure that Israeli culture is very advanced. Israeli culture is so advanced that they permit the raping of prisoners in Israeli prisons and the bombing of Palestinian children in tents. That is the very advanced Israeli civilization. These are the lies that they tell themselves. Testimonial means enlisting the support of somebody admired or famous to endorse an ideal or campaign. Testimonial can be used reasonably and makes sense for a footballer to endorse football boots, or manipulate it, such as when a footballer is used to support a political campaign they have only a limited understanding of. Limited understanding. They're shown people being bombed in their tents, and that means that they're not allowed to advocate for babies being bombed in their tents. I can't even read any further there. If you're enjoying what you're hearing so far, there's plenty of other material like this on the channel. Please consider hitting like, subscribe, sharing this with people who might also be interested. In general, the role of an Israel activist is to defend Israel as a country, but not necessarily to endorse every action of the government, army, or people. If a Jewish activist genuinely disagrees with some action, it is legitimate to say so, provided this is done in a way that defends and supports Israel as a country, and attempts to place the action in the context of a complex situation. All of these qualifiers make it impossible to criticize Israel. This can be done by reframing comments. For example, I understand where you're coming from. Personally, I also think it was wrong of the army to destroy those houses. And here the mitigation. However, you should also consider that Israelis are under a daily threat. So what about? So there's never just an admission. It was wrong. You can stop right there. I personally think it was wrong of the army to destroy those houses. Leave it. If you start explaining, you're saying it was okay. And the whole point of you saying, personally, I think it's wrong. If you're giving a reason why it's okay, then why do you think it's wrong? On some occasions, defending certain actions is counterproductive to Israeli interests and morally wrong. For instance, and I can't believe I put eyebrow raise in the margin. When the Jewish terrorist Baruch Goldstein, Jewish terrorist, he's a hero to many settlers. So maybe in 2002, it was okay to call him a Jewish terrorist, but I think it's pretty anti-Semitic to call him that. Jewish terrorist Baruch Goldstein massacred Palestinians at prayer in Hebron in 1994. The Israeli government condemned the action. It is always right to immediately condemn actions of this sort, because they had to. This guy shoots a bunch of people in prayer in a mosque, at the Ibrahimini Mosque. I mean, come on. You're trying to give Israel credit for that? And you're not trying to explain the fact that many Israelis view him as a hero, and he's seen as a hero to many people. He is part of that movement of Rabbi Kook, who said, you know, it's so painful that we allowed them to partition our country. We should have taken all of it in 48. Baruch Goldstein was part of that Rabbi kooky idea. I mean, all Zionism is kooky, but I would say Rabbi Kook's particularly kooky, no? It is important to distinguish between specific and general criticisms of Israel. Even Israel activists who don't support the approach of a specific Israeli government should be wary of criticizing the government in general terms. Israel is so fragile, it cannot bear internal criticism or it would crumble. That's why they're trying to tell you, you can't criticize the Israeli government. Imagine a democracy so weak, it can't even be criticized by stakeholders in the democracy. How are you ever going to build a nation when it's incapable of self-criticism? Just think about that. How am I going to grow as a person if I'm not capable of criticizing myself or allowing other people to criticize me? I can't grow as a person. How are you going to grow as a country? And how are you putting yourself forward as a democracy when you're telling people that they shouldn't criticize Israel? Criticism leveled at ministers or the government can undermine attempts to defend Israel at a later date. Yeah. People who start by making specific justifiable complaints about Israel often go on to make unfair general criticisms. I wrote, can't criticize, can't self-examine. Just walk away when not to engage. 1. When you don't know enough. When a Jewish student feels out of their depth in a discussion, they ought not to continue. Which is most of the time. Remember Simone Zimmerman in Israelism. I'll put a link in the description. I'm definitely out of cards now, so I can't put up a card for it. But I'll put a link in the description. She went to a student government meeting, I think it was at Berkeley or wherever she was, and she was out of her depth. She didn't know what a settlement was. Could you imagine being a 20-year-old Jewish kid and not knowing there was an occupation, not knowing there's a settlement? And she had been going to Israel her whole life, and she didn't know there was an occupation. She didn't know about settlements. When the situation is dangerous, I put LOL. Islamic extremists can be dangerous people. University campuses are renowned as a hotbed of extremism. Yeah, extreme Zionism. It is best to maintain a no-platform policy for racists and extremists, i.e. people who support Palestinian rights. The Israel activist must make sure that he or she can control the terms of a debate. You wouldn't want a level debate. You need to be in control. For example, an Israel activist shouldn't participate in a debate entitled Israel, a Terrorist State, because you're a coward, and you couldn't possibly take that on. There is no point in wasting time and energy arguing over the situation in the Middle East with a student who doesn't want to listen, like most Zionists. Militant Palestinians or extreme leftists aren't interested in considering reasonable arguments. There are no reasonable arguments to be made. These are reasonable people who are willing to hear reasonable arguments. There are no reasonable arguments when it comes to Israel. It is an occupying situation in which people were displaced, and Israel attempts to deny that that ever happened. Appear rational. Hysterical or excessively angry language will alienate readers. Write clearly and rationally. It can be difficult to remain rational and maintain a calm tone when media coverage has been terribly biased against Israel. When has media coverage ever been biased against Israel? I mean, come on. So, for example, say, I was disappointed with your apologetics for Hamas terrorists. There can be no justification for the deliberate targeting of young children. Can you imagine? Can you imagine an Israeli defender saying this with a straight face? Who is the one who deliberately targets young children? Is it the Palestinians or is it the Israelis? And again, we're not trying to count out bodies. We're just saying, as a deliberate policy, where do we see this over and over and over? Young children being shot in the heart. We have surgeons testifying to the fact of headshots and heart shots since October 2023. Are they all part of a Hamas conspiracy to lie about what they've witnessed on the operating table? So, for example, say, I was disappointed with your apologetics for Hamas terrorists. There can be no justification for the deliberate targeting of young children. Don't say, your support of disgusting terrorists shows that you and your paper are nothing but Arab lovers who don't understand that Hamas, Arafat, and their ilk are just murderers. As if there is something wrong with loving Arabs. You're just a bunch of Arab lovers. Try to use language that allows your audience to identify with the pro-Israel cause. For example, instead of saying Palestinian terrorism is a danger to stability in the Middle East, Use the more inclusive. We all understand what a danger to Middle East stability Palestinian terrorism is. Well, the better sentence would be everyone knows what a danger to stability Israel is in the Middle East. Israel is the number one cause of instability in the Middle East. Everybody knows this. And if they didn't know it in 2002, they certainly know it now. So we're further ahead. I jumped past sections that were talking about logistics, like how to set up talks, how to get articles published in a newspaper. That's not worth our time to cover that. That's any organization can work on this. This is specific. We're in a section now which is labeled Israel Accusations and Rebuttals. And this will be a pretty tedious portion of the review. Please, if you made it this far, we're gonna get there. Just stay with me. The collapse of the peace process and the road back to peace. Accusation. The Intifada began because the Palestinians were frustrated at their lack of progress at the peace talks and Israel's refusal to end the occupation. That is true. That's not refutable. Here's the attempted rebuttal. At Camp David, Israel's then Prime Minister Ehud Barak offered the Palestinians more than anyone had offered them before. So what? The offer included a Palestinian state. That's not true. We don't have any evidence of this, and all the Israelis have to do to rebut the conspiracy theory about this is to publish the documents in which Palestine was offered a state. I refuse to accept this talking point from Zionists. Do not allow them to put it forward. Unless they have evidence, all it is, at best, is a rumor that's favorable to them. But they have no evidence that Palestine was ever offered a state, and Rabin said to the Knesset that there would never be a state. It would be less than a state. It would be a state minus. So the idea that they were offered a state, not according to Rabin, and for Barak to say that, again, you need evidence of that. So I'm stopping it right there. The offer included a Palestinian state. Control over much of East Jerusalem, including the Old City, minus the Jewish quarter, with the Temple Mount to be discussed. Key things that have to be discussed, which will come up later, refugee return and evacuation of the settlements. These are non-starters. If you're not willing to discuss the big issues, there's no point in discussing who controls parts of East Jerusalem. This isn't serious. The trigger to the Intifada was when Israel displayed its colonial tendencies as Ariel Sharon, then leader of the opposition, went up to the Temple Mount. I would say that's mostly true. There are many things that led to the uprising of the Second Intifada, but to say that Ariel Sharon's visit to the Temple Mount had nothing to do with triggering it is ignorant. Just straight ignorant. I don't think I can even qualify it as more than that. Rebuttal. Sharon's visit to the Temple Mount was merely an excuse and not the reason for the start of the violence. Incitement had been going on for a long time before Sharon's visit, and sporadic violence had also occurred. The major demonstrations did not break out until a full day after the visit. So if it doesn't break out 5 seconds after the visit, then it doesn't count. The Mitchell report stated categorically the Sharon visit did not cause the Intifada. Oh, well, if the Mitchell report said it, well, then it must be true. It must be the gospel. The violence that started in September 2000 occurred for 2 major reasons. First, the Palestinian Authority leadership made a strategic choice to pursue violence. It's clearly not. In both the first and the second Intifada, Palestinian leadership was caught off guard. They didn't incite. People were frustrated, and they acted on their own. If anyone, and the person writing this clearly doesn't have knowledge about the history of the occupation. The first Intifada wasn't scripted. It happened, in fact, in a most unexpected way. These Palestinians were killed by this errant army jeep, and at some point things just snapped for Palestinians, and they had it. So the second thing here, yes, it may not have been that Sharon's visit was the final tipping point, but to say that had nothing to do with it is ignorant. As I say, it's just ignorant. There's nothing else to say there. Second, throughout the 7 years since the signing of the Oslo Peace Accord, incitement and anti-Israel propaganda had not ceased, because the settlements continued. The Palestinian people were not being prepared for peace with the Israelis, because the Israelis were not preparing for peace. School books and television continued to paint a picture of Israelis as the enemy. They are the occupiers. Until they're not the occupiers, it's fair to paint them that way. Accusation. The Israelis rejected peace in February 2001 by electing right-winger Ariel Sharon as prime minister by a massive majority. Sharon, an uncompromising figure with accusations of war crimes. An uncompromising war criminal hanging over him from the Lebanon war. Rebuttal. Ariel Sharon was elected after 5 months of Palestinian violence. This was an expression of Israeli disillusionment with the peace process and its handling by Ehud Barak. The Sharon government is not against peace. I wrote lie It is also not an extremist government. Lie. I don't know if I can keep reading that. There's limits to how many lies you can read, right? I'm already way past my lie quota for the day. Camp David, 2000. Barak's offer to the Palestinians was the most substantial and far-reaching that had ever been made. I don't know why they keep making a big deal about this. It doesn't matter what you offer. In many ways, you don't have a right to offer. The idea that you would offer the Palestinians their own land, and then you want to take credit for that, that's nothing. In Israel, people were stunned by the extent of the concessions that he was prepared to make. It is unclear whether the Israeli public were prepared to support Barak's deal. I would think clearly they weren't prepared to accept it. So putting it all on the Palestinians, this statement here alone implies that the breakdown was not simply among the Palestinians. The Palestinians were disillusioned with the so-called peace process. So were the Israelis. The Palestinians were asking themselves, if there's a peace process, why are the settlements continuing? And the Israelis were asking themselves, if there's a peace process, why is there suicide bombing? Both sides were disillusioned with the peace process because the peace process, quote unquote, was a fraud from the beginning. According to media reports, Barak's offer included Israeli redeployment from 95% of the West Bank and 100% of the Gaza Strip. This is not true. What about the settlements? This is excluding the settlements. So when they say that, the creation of a Palestinian state in that area, where is the proof that Palestine was offered a state? There has to be proof of that. In return, Arafat had to declare the quote-unquote end of conflict and agree that no further claims on Israel could be made in the future. This is just Israel trying to force down no right of refugee return. Without the right of refugee return, there is no grappling with the root causes of this conflict. The root causes of this conflict come back to 1948, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, and the displacement of an entire people to create a fraudulent nation called Israel. If you can't grapple with that, then we can't go any further. We can come to say, look, there's a bunch of people here now. We're not asking you to kick out all the Jews. That is not a reasonable thing. But what we have to say is, you're going to have to accommodate all the Palestinians that come back, and we're going to have to live together. That's the only option. One democratic state. And I'll put a link to Jeff Halper's book that advocates for this. So, trying to strong-arm, Arafat has no authority to declare an end to the conflict. The Palestinian people alone have a right to declare an end of the conflict. And they will declare an end to the conflict, as a man said in Killing Gaza, another wonderful documentary. I'll put a link to that in the description. He says, when you've killed all of us, then you can come into Gaza. Not before. And I stand with the Palestinians on that. Since Camp David, the Palestinian leadership has attempted to lay the blame at everyone's door but their own. They accuse the Americans of not being well enough prepared for the talks. They claim that Barak caused their failure due to his all-or-nothing approach, his insistence on an end-of-conflict agreement. However, what Camp David really showed was that the Palestinians were not ready for peace. The people had not been prepared for the fact that they might have to make serious compromises for peace, neither would the Israelis. That's why you said that it wasn't clear that Israelis would support that. I would rewrite this to say, Palestinians refused to accept the manufactured consent that was being prepared for them by Ehud Barak and the Israelis. The Palestinian use of terror is understandable and legitimate, as it is their only weapon against the oppression of Israeli occupation. I would never make this accusation. I would say something along the lines of legitimate use of resistance against illegal and immoral occupiers is understandable and legitimate. But the use of terror, if I'm allowing them to frame this as terrorism, as I've said before in other videos, I condemn suicide bombing in every context, in every situation. That is never an answer. I understand why, but I would never justify it. I can understand why someone would be in such a place of despair that they would see this as a righteous action instead of what it is, something highly immoral. But most of the actions that we are examining, for example, the Great March of Return, in which people marched toward a fence and they were shot in the knee, shot in the abdomen, shot in their legs, that was a form of peaceful protest. And so when we see peaceful protests, this is still called terrorism. So the idea that all Palestinian resistance is suicide bombing isn't even accurate. But you wouldn't know that unless you'd looked at this. If you just accept the Israeli narrative and you allow them to use these kinds of frames in which everything is terror and the word resistance doesn't appear anywhere, then you have a problem. There is always an alternative to terrorism. The greatest leaders of last century, who fought for their people against oppression, rejected terrorism and attacks on civilians. Martin Luther King, Gandhi, Nelson Mandela all achieved their aims through other methods, but Israel attacked civilians. So who are you to lecture? There is never an excuse for terrorism, that's right. including Jewish terrorism and attacks by Jews on Palestinian civilians. So Israel has no moral ground to be making these arguments. They're the last people who can argue. They deliberately target civilians all the time. In fact, they deliberately target children. Since when is Israel in a moral position to make these arguments? And as I've said, when the Palestinians have engaged in nonviolent protest, effectively nonviolent protest, as I say, throwing rocks at highly armored vehicles cannot be considered something dangerous. Oh no, my armored vehicle might get a dent. Those Israeli soldiers are not in any kind of real danger. These people are expressing understandable frustration, and it's legal and moral for them to throw rocks at their occupiers. But that's called terrorism. For the Palestinians, there's even less justification, as they chose a path of terror whilst in the midst of a peaceful process that was reaping results. It was not reaping results. And the settlements continued. Notice there's no mention of the settlements in any of this because the settlements are a major problem. Palestinians live under Israeli occupation. Rebuttal. Israeli occupation is frequently used to legitimate terrorism. It's worth noting that as a result of the implementation of the Oslo peace agreements, approximately 97 to 98% of Palestinians living in the West Bank or Gaza Strip live under the jurisdiction of the Palestinian Authority. It doesn't mean anything to say. So for people who don't understand Oslo, that sounds really big. It doesn't matter if you live under the jurisdiction of the Palestinian Authority, but Israeli soldiers can come and go, and your place is cut through by Israeli roads that you're not allowed to ride on. It doesn't matter that you're under the jurisdiction of the Palestinian Authority. What matters is that you're part of your own state, and Israel has nothing to do with you. By area, over 85% of Gaza, because it's a nest of resistance, and 39.7% of the West Bank are under Arafat's control. I mean, imagine this. They think it's a rebuttal to say that 40% of the West Bank is under Arafat's control. And the original statement was Palestinians live under Israeli occupation. And they think it's a win to say that only 60% of the West Bank is under occupation. Just so blind, unable to see what they're saying themselves. No ability to reflect. Accusation. Israel uses excessive force against people, often children, who are merely throwing stones. Again, what's refutable about that statement? Rebuttal. Israel is constantly being accused of a disproportionate reaction. Because, why are they being accused? Because they do. The question of proportionality is somewhat absurd. A proportional response to a bus bombing would be for Israel to place a bomb on a Palestinian bus. Well, much more than that, they bomb Palestinian buses. This is obviously unacceptable, but that's not true. That's what Israel does. Israel's responses are designed to neutralize specific threats. And unlike suicide bombings, they are targeted perpetrators, not civilians. This is not true. They target not only the perpetrators, but the families of those perpetrators. If they wanted to be surgical, they could. We're trying to pretend as though Israel doesn't have the ability to snipe or kill somebody. They do that all the time. But what they want to do is send a message. And so they blow up buildings to get one terrorist. And they say, well, we were attacking a terrorist. So they keep using the word absurd, proportional. So this is somewhat absurd. This is obviously unacceptable. It's equally absurd to suggest that Israel must be wrong because more Palestinians have died than Israelis, as if it were a competition. And were more Israelis to be killed, Israel would become the good guys. This is not to say that civilians never die. Regrettably, innocents, including children, are occasionally caught in the crossfire. Again, I underline, it's not occasionally. They're caught all the time. Can't even read anymore there. Protesters do not throw small pebbles, as is suggested by the tone of the media, but rather large rocks capable of serious harms. No Israeli soldier has ever died from being hit by a rock, a stone, or a large rock capable of serious harm. If this were true, all they'd have to do is produce, as in the example of blah, 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 blah. They don't produce it. This is just Hasbara. No one's ever been killed since the time of David and Goliath by a large stone. Israel is described as a country of gangs born in crime. Well, it is. I don't see what's objectionable there. The Jews are portrayed as arrogant and sly traitors, and Zionism is a racist movement and a germ. As a result of all of this, it is clear that Palestinian children are educated in an atmosphere of incitement. Again, here, atmosphere of incitement means dealing with reality. What is it that Palestinian children need to be educated about in classrooms? When their classrooms are blown up and they're not allowed to go to school, they learn from the reality of watching their friends get killed by snipers, having their parents get killed by bombings, having their brothers get killed by the IDF. They don't need to go to school to find out that Israel is a country of gangs born in crime and that Zionism is a racist movement. They just believe their lying eyes. Palestinian refugee issue. Accusation. Israel systematically expelled the Palestinian citizens of the area in 1948. That is a true, irrefutable statement. Rebuttal. Why 700,000 Palestinians abandoned their homes in 1948 is a controversial question. It is not a controversial question. The Palestinians claim they were expelled. Why would they claim that? Recent scholarship has shown that this did happen, but only in a few isolated examples. It is not true. It was not a few isolated examples. The overwhelming majority left of their own accord to avoid the war or because they were encouraged to do so by the Arab leadership. Yeah, many people did leave to avoid a war. They didn't want to be killed in their homes. They didn't have any weapons. But this lie, they were encouraged to do so by the Arab leadership. Benny Morris has refuted this in The Birth of the Palestine Refugee Problem Revisited. In his endnotes, he says there is no evidence for this claim. And in fact, if Israel did have such evidence, all they'd have to do is produce it, and then they would be able to trumpet this. The fact that Israel cannot produce any evidence, and the fact that Benny Morris has himself searched the Israeli archive and hasn't found any evidence means this is a lie. There is no evidence, and in fact there are counterexamples, and Benny Morris provides a counterexample in those endnotes. Palestinians being forced back to their villages by the Arab Legion, saying you need to go back to your homes, you can't be on this road, we're trying to fight here. So there's counterexamples of this. In fact, the Jewish leadership tried to persuade the Arabs to stay, and I underlined that, and I put that's true in Haifa specifically, and then they went on here to cite Haifa because that's really the only time that I can think of that happening. It's an unusual case, but it did exist, and Golda Meir went on to later say, I think we should try to persuade some of them to come back, but I wouldn't go to any kind of extraordinary means to do so. If they don't want to, I'm not going to force them to come back. So this isn't to say that all Jews acted in the same way, but the overwhelming reality, the historical record that's come out, and the Israeli archive has been clamped shut again once all of this information got out, is that there was a systematic expulsion which didn't need to be enforced by an order. There was an atmosphere of expulsion and transfer in Zionism as a movement leading up to 1948. When you're all thinking the same way, you don't have to give an order. Everyone's thinking the same way, and Ben Gurion on numerous times is asking, why are there all these Arabs here? Or making a motion. What are we supposed to do with the village? And he made this motion. So the idea that there wasn't a systematic attempt to get rid of them, we have to ask ourselves, why were there 300,000 Palestinians expelled prior to May the 15th, 1948? Why? Because there was a systematic plan to ethnically cleanse, maybe not murder all of them, but to get them out. So persuade them by bombing their village, shelling them, threatening them, having loudspeakers saying, we're going to come kill all you dirty Arabs. Whatever they needed to say, and people were scared. What are they going to do, stay and fight to the last man? This is, again, an Israeli position. That's how the kibbutzim thought. They had been given weapons. They had been given weapons training. They said, you're going to die here to the last man. And so the Israelis despised the Palestinians for leaving because they thought, well, we would have never done that. Well, no, you wouldn't, because you had weapons training and you were told you've got to die here because this is your land. The Palestinians never thought that way. They'd dealt with conflict in the past. They'd fled conflict and came back. Remember, World War I wasn't that far away. It was in living memory for many of these people. So was World War II. When there's conflict, you can move away from your house and then come back. That's been that way for thousands of years all around the globe. In this case, the Israelis said, well, because you left, you can't come back. And that's new. And they think that that's supported because God gave them the land, whatever other lies that they tell. That's not even true theologically. They broke the covenant. They did not accept the Messiah. And whatever they're doing now is their own made-up nonsense based on Talmudic Judaism, which is a break with Mosaic Judaism. So they try to claim the legacy of Mosaic Judaism and say it's the same thing, but the type of Judaism they're practicing now is not the same thing. At the same time, between 1948 and 1951, around 500,000 Jews were expelled from the Arab nations amongst where they lived. Ask yourself that question. What happened between 1948 and 1951? So they don't ask why. Why were these Jews expelled? And what led to that? It says between 1948 and 1951, what happened in 1948 that would lead people? I'm not saying it's right, But I am saying there's a reason this happened. It didn't happen in isolation. The people didn't wake up in 1948 and said, you know what, we need to get rid of the Jews in our country. What happened was they had seen what had happened to the Palestinians and they reacted. I'm not saying it's right. I'm not saying it's moral. I'm saying it's totally understandable what they did. And so they're not trying to contextualize this and say, well, in reaction to the Nakba, people kicked Jews out of their countries. The newborn state absorbed and fully integrated these refugees. Today, there are no Jewish refugees from Arab lands as they have all been resettled because they encouraged that. They needed as many Jews on their land as possible so that they could make the case that this is a refuge. And a lot of times when they couldn't get the Jews to move there, they bullied them and terrorized them to move there. Most famously, as I've said many times on this channel, Avi Shleim talks as an Iraqi Jew about the Mossad policy of terrorizing the Iraqi Jews and creating fissures in that community where they felt very settled and very at home in Iraq and forced many of them to leave. And they found out later there were bombs in the synagogues put there by Mossad. Israel accusation. Israel has its own right of return for Jews, but won't allow Palestinians an equivalent. This is just racist. Rebuttal. Israel's law of return allows any Jew to move to live in Israel. Israel has no objection to an equivalent law of return to allow Palestinian refugees to move to live in Palestine. What objection is to allowing them to move to Israel? Okay, what is Israel? So this gets you to force them to ask the question, what are the borders of Israel? This is an uncomfortable question to ask, and I think the person writing this is too ignorant to know that Israel has no fixed borders. So when they make this argument, oh, we have no problem with, to say I think this is out of bounds now, but in 2002, maybe someone thought they could get away with this. To say Israel has no objection to an equivalent law of return to allow Palestinian refugees to move to live in Palestine. Okay, where's Palestine and where's Israel? That would stop that argument pretty dead cold. The objection is to allowing them to move to Israel. Israel was created as a state for Jews because the Holocaust proved that Jews needed refuge. A Palestinian state can play the same role for Palestinians who holocausted the Palestinians, the Israelis. But that is not Israel's job. That's fine. So then create a Palestinian state where Palestinians can return to. Again, they don't see the contradictions in their arguments. If Israel were to absorb all the Palestinian refugees, Jews could quickly become a minority in their own land. And I underlined, it's not their land. This would undermine the entire point of the partition plan of 1947. The partition plan of 1947 has no legal rights. It has no international legal rights. It was just some idea from the United Nations. The United Nations has no authority to impose that on the majority population. The partition plan of 1947 is immoral and illegal. So don't allow people to use the partition plan as some kind of moral high ground. It's not. Israel has accepted that it will aid the refugees and offer some compensation, but Israel cannot accept total responsibility for the creation of the refugee problem. So I wrote in the margin, why have you soaked Germany for billions? And many of those claims are fraudulent. But you cannot offer compensation for the refugee problem that you created single-handedly. Diverse opinions. The question of why the Palestinian Arabs left in 1947-1940 has been the subject of much recent scholarship. Conventional opinion said that all of the Arab civilians left voluntarily. That's not conventional opinion. That was Israeli Hasbara. Everybody knew. Everyone outside of the Israelis in their own little echo chamber knew that something. That's why UNRWA was created. If it was that they left voluntarily, then okay. They were generally instructed to leave by their own leadership. That's not true. By contrast, Arab historians have accused Israel of expelling local residents or causing them to flee in fear of their lives. I can't believe even in 2002, this was still being denied. There is ample evidence that Arab leadership did encourage and instruct many people to leave. Then where is it? If there is ample evidence to produce one example of Arab leadership telling their people to leave. Benny Morris, Zionist, cannot produce such information. We're almost there. Thank you for those of you who are still here watching. I commend you. You are really committed to learning more about this. If you haven't hit like and subscribe yet, please do. Israeli settlements. Accusation. Israeli settlements are illegal and in violation of the Oslo peace agreements. That is 100% true. And they're still going to try to offer a rebuttal. When Israel captured the territories in 1967, they took over administration from powers who themselves did not have sovereignty over the areas. Okay, then who did? So let's follow the argument. If Jordan did not have sovereignty over the areas, which they did via a secret agreement with Meir and King Hussein, then who did? Are you going to say it was still the British mandate? The Palestinian leadership, it will be remembered, themselves rejected sovereignty in these areas when they rejected the 1947 partition plan. So did it devolve to Israel? These areas cannot therefore be considered occupied territories, as they were not occupied from another nation with legitimate sovereignty. A more accurate term would be disputed territories whose future Israel is committed to resolving through negotiations. It's an interesting point. I've never heard it articulated this way, but I see the nice little legal loophole. The problem is Israel recognized that as being part of Jordan, and they facilitated the creation of the West Bank through a secret agreement with Jordan and restraining the Arab Legion so that they wouldn't have to fight them. So this is revisionist. It's an interesting argument absent the evidence. But since we have the evidence, then this argument is absurd. There is no attempt, nor has there ever been, to remove the Palestinian population from the West Bank or Gaza Strip areas. I put not true. I can't imagine they would say this with a straight face. This would be from someone... I mean, I can't believe someone would actually write this down. Even a Zionist would say there is no attempt, nor has there ever been, to remove the Palestinian population from the West Bank or Gaza Strip areas. I mean, the lies, you just... Accusation, the settlements are the main obstacle to peace. Rebuttal, settlements have never been the major obstacle to peace. They just say it. So the rebuttal is settlements have never been the major obstacle to peace. That's their argument. Accusation, Israel has no legitimacy and no claim in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. That's true. Rebuttal, the West Bank and Gaza Strip is best regarded as territory over which there are competing claims, which should be resolved in peace process negotiation. There are no competing claims. Israel has no claim to those areas. They have no claims. The Palestinians, however, live there. So that claim is easily superior. That doesn't have to be resolved in conflict negotiations for peace. Everyone can see, anyone who knows that 2 + 2 = 4 is saying people who assert sovereignty over a land via some theological argument versus people who have titles and deeds to that land, that's a pretty easy thing. We don't really need to go to a negotiation for that. Israel has valid claims to title in this territory based not only on its historic and religious connection to the land and its recognized security needs, recognized by itself, but also on the fact that the territory was not under the sovereignty of any state. It was under the sovereignty of Jordan and came under Israeli control in a war of self-defense imposed upon Israel. I wrote how, ? Listen to that sentence. It came under Israeli control in a war of self-defense imposed upon Israel. Israel started the 1967 war. It was not imposed on Israel. Israel chose. It was a war of choice that they got sign-off from the Americans to do. I'm really feeling the burden here as I get towards the end, and we're almost done, so thanks for your patience, of people noting, and this was, I recently took a class with Palestine Nexus on Palestinians, and one of the people was pointing out that not everyone is built to refute Hasbara. I mean, I'm tired now, and I'm just doing a review on a YouTube channel. But I can't imagine doing this for life. And there's people like Zach Foster who have the talent and the ability to deal with it. But you're just always running up a treadmill, repeating the same arguments to the same lies. And what it does is it prevents you from digging into the larger issues, the richness of Palestinian culture, the depth of Palestinian character, the other issues that we can learn of the history of Palestine, the nature of Arab hospitality. There are so many other things that are interesting to get to, but we can't get there if we're always dealing with Hasbara. Now, I'm not saying it's not important to deal with Hasbara. I applaud the people who do it, in a sense, for a living, people like Zach Foster. But the rest of us have to do other things. I'm giving this the place it quote-unquote deserves and needs, because people need to hear these arguments. I need to hear them myself, and that's why I'm trying to engage and encounter them here. But this cannot be it certainly won't be the primary concern of Palestine Bookshelf as long as I'm in charge of it. It cannot be I would argue it cannot be our primary concern as people who are supporting Palestinians. We have to focus on other things. The amount of time it takes to respond to all of these lies is prohibitive. We have to focus on other things, but we can't ignore the arguments and not know them. So I think it's important to know them, have some familiarity with them, maybe take the time to do a review like this, and then move on. We can't spend the rest of our life dealing with lies. We have to be focused on truths. Accusation. The creation of a Jewish state displaced the original inhabitants, the Palestinian Arabs. That is true. Rebuttal. Before the Jews came to Palestine, it was underpopulated and neglected. I wrote, by what standards? What does underpopulation mean? So a country has to have a certain population to be considered legitimate. So if you're underpopulated, you can just move into a country and take it over? It was neglected. It's their country to neglect. Even if I accept it, which is not true that it was neglected. It just wasn't up to, I don't know, Industrial Revolution standards. But it was getting there. If you look at I'll put a link to in the description to Palestine 1920 that talks about a country that was very much adapting and modernizing actually quite quickly, even in 1920. So the idea that it was underpopulated and neglected is itself problematic, but even if we concede both of those points, that wouldn't be a reason for you to come in and take it over, either legally or morally. The Jews cultivated and built the land. Good for them. They did not displace the local population at this time, nor attempt to do so. That's not true. Every Jewish landlord was encouraged by avoda ivrit, which was the idea of Jewish labor, to expel Palestinian serfs, effectively, people who had worked the land for centuries for the landlords. Once they bought the land, they evicted them. So that is an attempt to displace the local population. We have documentation of this. The fact that this is denied or not even brought up shows, again, the ignorance of the person. And it was a kid, right? This was written by the World Union of Jewish Students. I've come to expect absolutely zero education from young Jewish kids because they weren't taught it by their elders. Why would I have expected Jewish Zionists to have educated their children on what really happened? They're not going to do that. And now you have there's this, I find this really joke on the Mark Maron podcast. Seth Rogen appears and says, I was lied to about the creation of Israel. We were told that the land was empty and we just showed up, the door was open. And he's sitting there laughing about it, but it's not a joke. He's saying, and he says, I'm afraid of the Jews. I'm afraid of being canceled. This is a Jewish guy saying this. Is he anti-Semitic? All Jewish land was bought and paid for. That's true prior to 1947. Most of it was sold by absentee landlords who owned and neglected it. That may have been true, but we're talking about 7% of the land. And they want to take over 78% and then the remaining 22%. Accusation: Zionism is racism. Zionism is an imperialist ideology. Again, maybe in 2002 you could have gotten away with denying this. In 2025, nobody believes this to be false. And so their rebuttal is, in 1975, the UN passed a resolution that declared Zionism to be racism. This motion was pushed through by an alliance of the Arab states and the Soviet bloc. And then they goes through again about, the Palestinian citizens of Israel. They are afforded full legal and civil rights. It's not true. They cannot marry people in other occupied places. They can't marry people in East Jerusalem or in Gaza or in the West Bank and bring them to live in Israel. So they're not afforded full legal and civil rights. We can't even get into more of the other things. The Palestinian Arabs were not innocent victims. Many supported Hitler in Germany during World War II. This is just not true. The Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, a major leader, publicly supported Hitler and allied himself with him. Even if that's true, which I think it is, that doesn't mean that all Palestinian Arabs did. I would like to find some sort of opinion poll in which they could substantiate this assertion. Many supported Hitler in Germany during World War II. They were busy dealing with the Zionists who were murdering them in Palestine. Accusation: no other country in the world, whether member of the UN or not, has been so frequently criticized by the UN. Oh, poor Israel. It's true that Israel is the focus of more investigative committees, special representatives, and rapporteurs than any other state in the UN system. I wrote, why? Why? Because everyone's anti-Semitic, right? That's always the answer. The special representative of the Director General of UNESCO visited Israel 51 times during 27 years of activity. A special mission has been sent by the Director General of the International Labour Organization to Israel and the territories every year for the past 17 years. This is undisputable. What is disputed is the reason for this. Israel has been the subject of many emergency special sessions of the UN. Yet bizarrely, no such session has ever been convened with respect to the Chinese occupation of Tibet, the Indonesian occupation of East Timor, the Syrian occupation of Lebanon, the slaughters in Rwanda, and the disappearances in Zaire or the horrors of Bosnia. I put LOL next to that. So what they're trying to do, this is a whataboutism, So they're trying to conflate these things and make them the same thing. Because no one's going to say this is good. No one's going to say, yeah, the Chinese occupation of Tibet, that's awesome. Indonesian occupation of East Timor, that's great. Syrian occupation of Lebanon, that's awesome. Slaughters in Rwanda. So they're trying to say, well, look at all these bad things. What about them? There are any number of reasons why they're not brought up. In fact, it's interesting to point out all of those things are not brought up, but Israel is brought up to show you that's how much more important the Israeli occupation of Palestine is than all of this. So it's not to say that the slaughters in Rwanda aren't important, but according to the UN, according to an international group of your peers, other countries, they consider all of those less important than Israel and its occupation of Palestine. So there's no connection. They just try to say, well, this is all the same thing. Why don't these get any attention? Because they're nothing compared to what you're doing. It is ludicrous to suggest, as the UN frequently does, that Israel is a worse abuser of human rights than Iraq or Syria. It is. It's not ludicrous. And again, in 2002, that may have been possible before we knew what was going on in Iraq, but we know now. So the accusation is Israel is a discriminatory state and claims that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East are ridiculous. There are a number of imperfect democracies such as Israel's in the region. So I agree mostly with that statement. A guaranteed framework of equal citizen rights, including access to justice and freedom of expression, assembly, and association, as well as economic and social rights to enable all citizens to exercise their freedoms. All Israel's citizens, regardless of religion and ethnicity, are equal before the law. But this is 2002, so we have basic laws that have been passed since 2002 that states that Jewish citizens of Israel have a higher status than non-Jewish citizens of Israel. So, in a sense, that may have been right in 2002, but it's been outdated since then. It's not true, and no country can honestly call itself and people who know me from the Stephen Heiner channel know I'm no great fan of democracy, no great apologist for democracy. But if you want to think that it's the greatest thing ever, how could you call yourself a democracy and still occupy and treat people, occupy a certain part and subject them to the treatment the Palestinians have and still say that you're a democracy? Institutions of representation and accountability, including free and fair elections and procedures to ensure continuous accountability of public officials to the public. Then why were there all those protests of Benjamin Netanyahu leading up to October in 2023? I saw some of these protests myself on television when I was there in 2023. Public officials are also accountable under the law, except for Netanyahu, who cannot be prosecuted because he's prime minister. A civil society which includes free and pluralistic media of communication, civil associations, consultative processes, and other forums to ensure popular participation in the political process. This is also not true. Any media that's publishing things, it can be censored by a state security agency. I'm forgetting the name of it now. I don't think it's Shabak. I think it's someone else that can supervise media releases. So that law doesn't exist in many other countries, that reporting on occupation or so quote unquote security situations has to be run by a censor. But Israel is still propounding itself as a liberal Western democracy. But they can't provide any examples of any other quote-unquote liberal Western democracies that do the same thing they do. Accusation: Israel isn't interested in peace in the Middle East. Israel should be negotiating with Syria to bring peace to the region. Once again, I agree with that accusation. Rebuttal: Israel has often tried to reach peace with her neighbors. I wrote in the margin, it is the only country in the world to have bombed every capital of its neighbors. And this is 2002, but recently Syria's government fell. They went and bombed 80% of Syria's military and occupied more land beyond the Golan. That's how interested in peace Israel is. Don't listen to what Israel says. Watch what they do. Actions always speak louder than words, not only for us as persons, but for nations as states. In the 1940s, in a number of Arab countries, including Iraq, Libya, Egypt, and Syria, so they say in the 1940s, what they mean to say is after 1948, there were anti-Jewish riots in which over 1,000 Jews were killed. This together, and if you realize that, listen to the statement, Iraq, Libya, Egypt, and Syria. So 1,000 Jews being killed, it's never great for 1,000 of any nationality to be killed. But let's break that up and say it was 250 in each. Notice how much less power there is to the argument that there was widespread anti-Semitism. You said 250 Jews were killed in Iraq, where there were millions of Jews living, if not millions, hundreds of thousands of Jews living. And you say 250 were killed. Are you then able to say there was mass, widespread hatred of Jews? This, together with growing official anti-Semitism after the establishment of Israel, led large numbers of Jews to flee their previous homes for the new Jewish state, also because they were coerced by Mossad, who planted bombs in synagogues. They're not going to say that. Accusation: Israel treats her Arabs like apartheid South Africa treated blacks. Rebuttal: Israel has always consciously tried to avoid imitating the situation in South Africa. It's not true. They consulted, sold weapons to South Africa, and invited their politicians over, and their politicians said impolitic things. I'm remembering now, some of this is talked about in Anthony Lowenstein's The Palestine Laboratory. Goodness, I'm going to have a lot of videos, to probably more than I've ever done before, to cite in the description. But all of them will be there for you. If you're interested in all the things that I'm talking about, go to the description and you'll be able to cross-reference all the videos that I've been referencing. And I think that's one of the things I'm realizing about the video. In a certain sense, this video is a culmination of a lot of work I've done so far, is because I've done the research on the history so that when I read this, all of this reads as ridiculous. And that's what I would encourage you to do. If you're familiar with the history, you're never going to be afraid of dealing with a Zionist or dealing with Hasbara, because you'll know enough to know that they're lying. They're already lying, but if you inherently know because you've done the work and you've studied, then you don't need any notes. They need all these notes. They're giving these notes to people so they can memorize them and then repeat back what they memorized on Piers Morgan or any other sort of situation. You don't have to memorize things if you know things. And you know things because you take the time to study. And if you take the time to study, you'll know this is a lie. Arab Israelis have full voting rights, representation in parliament, access to education at all levels, something with which South African blacks were denied. Israeli Arabs have the right to live and work anywhere in the country. That's not true. They're not allowed to live in the occupied territories, something that was never the case for black South Africans. So they make a few statements and saying, oh, that's not at all like what's going on, instead of realizing apartheid is about discrimination against people because of their race and displacement of taking over their land and territory. That's what's going on here. If you made it to the end, I appreciate you. Mention it in the comments that you made it to the end so I can thank you personally. Hasbara Handbook, Promoting Israel on Campus. As I said, there's a link to it in the description, so find a copy, read along yourself, make your own markings. Don't take my word for it, read it yourself. If you'd like to support this channel, as I said for the final time in this review, hit like, subscribe. It's a free way for you to support our work. If you want to thank me for this presentation, there is a link to PayPal and Buy Me a Coffee. You can send a donation that way. If you want to support this work on an ongoing basis, there's links to Patreon, YouTube membership below. There's also my Amazon wish list where you can buy a book, sort of sponsor the video by buying it for me and sending it my way. You'll also see links to other books that have nothing to do with Palestine, that probably has to do with my Stephen Heiner channel or my work on the Americans in Paris. Feel free to go over to those other channels. I'm not stopping you, but just obviously if you want to buy a book for this channel, buy a book on Palestinian issues, and you'll see plenty of them on my wish list. Also remember that once this channel gets monetized, which hopefully maybe by the time you watch this video some months from now, it will have been, but we're working towards monetization now. And the way that you can do that is by watching as many videos on the channel as you can. Once the channel gets monetized, 100% of the profits are going to go to the Palestine Children's Relief Fund, which is linked below. It's a medical charity that helps Palestinian children get the medical care they need who could not otherwise get it. So consider supporting them directly. There's a link to them in the description, but you can support them indirectly by supporting this channel and getting the word out. And as I say, watching as many videos as you can, putting up with the advertising, or if you have YouTube Premium, you're supporting me regardless, and you don't have to watch the advertising. I'm a big YouTube Premium person myself, but that's a discussion for another time. Until next time, enjoy your reading.